The fall of Vraks before the renegade Cardinal Zaphan's rebel army marked the loss of an important arsenal world. Heretics had broken a link in the long supply chain that kept the Imperial Guard regiments around the Eye of Terror ready for battle, threatening the most dire consequences if a new Black Crusade were to begin. Despite the enemy entrenching themselves in the considered impregnable Vraks citadel, Imperial generals, strategos adepts and logisticians from the Departamento Munitorum were ordered to devise a plan to reclaim the world. The war promised to be long and brutal, but according to their calculations, with sufficient troops and established supplies, they would be able to grind down the defenders and capture the citadel, the planet's nerve center, within 12 years of siege. The choice fell on the regiments raised from Krieg. The Death Corps consist of people born to serve the Emperor. Underneath the contaminated surface of their home planet lies a human factory, existing solely to produce soldiers destined to be sent to the forefront of the most toxic and hazardous war zones of the Imperium. These ideologically conditioned fighters are distinguished by their unwavering loyalty and absolute willingness to sacrifice their lives for victory, qualities that will prove invaluable when confronting the horrors of Vraks. The Vraksian renegades themselves were well prepared for the Imperial counter-assault. They occupied advantageous defensive positions, and thanks to the inexhaustible supplies stockpiled in the Arsenal World's depots, faced no problems with equipment. For 10 years of continuous warfare, the rebels exterminated millions of Death Corps soldiers, but gradually the Kriegs pressed them back. The ring around the citadel and the entrenched renegade cardinal tightened ever more, the roar of Imperial guns growing louder. For a brief moment it seemed to the Imperials that the end was near, that the traitor forces were already exhausted, that they were about to break. But it was not so. Fate often shuns such simple solutions. The slaughter on Vraks would continue for much longer, sating the hunger of the thirsting gods. Chapter 7. The First Battle of Vraks. Officially, the Siege of Vraks began in the year 813 of the 41st millennium, when the heavy artillery of the 88th Siege Army of the Imperial Guard, Krieg, opened fire on the outer defensive lines of Vraks citadel. While the guns continued bombardment, millions of men dug the first trenches, preparing for the onset of a long war of attrition against the heretic forces. There would be no swift victory in this battle, only a 12-year campaign during which the opponent would bleed to death. Every breakthrough would come at a great price, but the soldiers of Krieg lived and trained to make such sacrifices in the Emperor's name. The war has now lasted for 10 years. Both opposing sides launched offensive after offensive across the scorched and artillery-ravaged no-man's land. Each side experienced its victories and defeats, but the outer defensive positions were breached and the second line of defence broken. In the year 821 of the 41st millennium, due to the actions of a shock contingent of Space Marines from the Dark Angels chapter, the Vraks spaceport was destroyed. By the year 822 of the 41st millennium, only the inner defence line and the fortresses surrounding walls stood between the siege regiments of Krieg and their final target. Now the citadel was surrounded, and all inside seemed doomed. Yet Cardinal Zaphan was not alone in his struggle. Thanks to Deacon Mammon, the renegade cardinal had secured the support of the Alpha Legion. While the Imperial guns were shattering the defences, the Chaos Space Marines were summoning reinforcements to aid the traitors. The psionic signal of Arcos. The sorcerers of the Alpha Legion sent a psychic signal through the warp, summoning old allies to Vraks. Those forces lurking around the Eye of Terror that heard the call flocked like moths to a flame, drawn by promises of battle, slaughter, and plunder. However, the warp's currents did not favour the travellers. The warp storms raging unceasingly around the Eye were fierce, and not even the most skilled navigator could overcome them. The Imperial fleet ships attempting to break through the storm risked being destroyed or emerging at any point in the galaxy. However, for the armadas of the Chaos worshippers, the warp's capriciousness was a blessing. Should the Dark Gods wish to hurl them into a distant system, so be it. Ancient starships, all clad in mighty armor, covered in unholy runes and bearing the scars of millennia of endless battles, heard the call. Within the immortal hulls, Chaos warriors, eternally ready for combat, awaited their chance to prove themselves before the gods in hopes of great rewards. Ancient engines roared back to life as warships and transports moved, readying to once again plunge into the depths of the Imperium. Most who received Arcos's signal were raiders with their support transports. Such ships consistently launched attacks from the Eye of Terror, at times descending upon colonies and poorly defended convoys. Many were mere pirates or other fugitives from imperial justice. Worst of all were the bloodthirsty bands of chaos worshippers, splintered squads of space marines who had broken away from traitorous legions. Arcos's message proclaimed Vraks was a rich prize for looting and pillaging, and they came. The warp currents bring chaos fleets. Observation Station DM 498066 was one of many secret outposts monitoring the Eye of Terror. Vraks itself was merely a waypoint for sorting this information. The astropathic choir located there could quickly relay vital messages to surrounding systems. And in the case of incursions or even the approach of a Black Crusade, warn imperial worlds of impending threats. Undoubtedly, the choir of Vraks fell silent, having been killed or taken hostage by Cardinal Zafan's henchmen. Although the Arsenal world was lost, other systems were still communicating and transmitting information from the outposts. The sensitive warp sails of Station DM 498066 detected the approach of several large, unidentified ships, far from regular trade and patrol routes. The astropath at the station sent a warning which reached the high command of the Scarus battle fleet several weeks later. With meticulous planning and after consulting with their personal seers, the commanders of the Imperial fleet dispatched patrol groups to the star systems presumably targeted by the invading armada. Several cruiser groups were alerted and brought to full combat readiness in anticipation of the approaching Chaos ships. Even the Adeptus Astartes Rapid Response Strike Force prepared to mobilize swiftly to intercept the heretics if necessary. The Ordo Malleus secretly began gathering information, ever vigilant to threats emanating from the Eye of Terror. The Inquisitors dispatched a null ship, a disposable vessel crewed by servitors and a single pariah, leaving no trace in the warp, equipped with powerful auger and communications apparatus. It could locate the mysterious ships and report their whereabouts. The null ship accomplished its mission, discovering the enemy, and then embarked on its suicidal mission deep into the raging warp storms, continuing to transmit data until the very last moment. The intelligence received seriously alarmed the Inquisition. The ships were undoubtedly Chaos raiders, many of which were the size of cruisers, and they had already joined other warships in the depths of space. It appeared that the Armada was mustering forces for a decisive attack, with the presence of already 30 vessels noted. Astro-telepathic messages spread through the ports, bases and command ships of the Scarus battle fleet. Reconnaissance and patrol ships were redirected to cover the likely approaches of the enemy armada. Major capital warships, including the fleet's flagship, Constantine Valdor, an Emperor-class battleship, were also ordered to depart their designated ports. The fleet mobilized and prepared for military engagements. The enemy armada of 30 ships was finally identified, and it was now necessary to corner and destroy it. The Imperial fleet in the Vraks system. 10 years had passed since the arrival of the first transports, with the vanguard units of the 88th Siege Army in the system. As the concentration of forces concluded, the need for adequate provisioning of the ongoing campaign increased. Ships delivering new soldiers, thousands of tons of ammunition, replacement military equipment, fuel, and all necessities to defeat the enemy over 12 years arrived convoy after convoy. These valuable resources required appropriate protection, hence a detachment of the Imperial fleet was stationed in the Vraks system. It included a squadron of escort frigates of the Sword type to cover arriving and departing convoys, as well as to patrol the outer boundaries of the system. A squadron of in-system monitors had been towed to provide protection for cargo ships near orbit. These vessels possessed sufficient firepower to deter the most brazen pirates or even raiders from the Eye of Terror. These forces were under the command of Rear Admiral Rasiak from the deck of the Lord Bellerophon, a lunar-class cruiser. The flagship, lovingly called Big Cutthroat by the crew, served as the main deterrent in the star system, a powerful battleship sent by the battle fleet Scarus for the duration of the campaign. One of more than 600 Lunar-class battleships in the Segmentum Obscurus, the Lord Bellerophon was excellently armed and could crush anything that pirates, aliens, or even the majority of traitor bands could muster against it. The flagship was constantly leading convoy escorts with supplies, or was on combat patrol. However, after a decade of ground warfare with no slightest sign of a threat to the system from space, and the destruction of the Vraks starport, which meant a complex and lengthy planetary assault, the fleet standing watch gradually lost its shape. The crew of the Lord Bellerophon was redistributed for service on other starships, as was happening with human resources on the other ships. The escort squadron dwindled in number, and the remaining 3 vessels required repairs and rearmament, having plied warp routes from the supply hubs of the Scarus sector all the way to the forge world Lucius. Only the defensive monitors remained in good operational readiness. In such proximity to the Eye of Terror, the need for ships always remained high, so the command of the battle fleet Scarus demanded its cruiser for more urgent needs. It seemed Vraks had decreased in priority, and a ruthless enemy, a sense of complacency, had crept into the ranks of the Imperials. No one anticipated an attack on the system, especially a force powerful enough to completely crush the defenders. In all reports, Rear Admiral Rasiak stated that the supply lines and the system as a whole were excellently protected and in good hands. Soon he would recant his own statements. The first battle for Vraks. Rear Admiral Rasiak was aware of the active operations of the battle fleet Scarus. He also received orders to prepare for a possible invasion by major forces of chaos in the sector. It was now, under the shadow of the looming threat, that the Rear Admiral reassessed his situation and found it unsatisfactory. His small battle group was not capable of countering an invasion, and his personal cruiser was manned with a minimal crew. Escort ships also suffered from crew shortages and numerous malfunctions due to the prolonged absence of repairs. The ships required an extended stay in the docks. The only battle-ready vessels were the monitors, yet even they required additional crew, and their ammunition supply was insufficient for regular drills. Under Rasiak's command were merely 7 ships, which was clearly inadequate. The paramount task for the counter-admiral was to find crew for the ships. The crew of all vessels of the Imperial Navy was composed of unskilled or minimally skilled labourers, such as shell handlers or disaster response firefighters. Such individuals could be recruited from anywhere, so Rasiak contacted the forces of the Departamento Munitorum stationed on Vraks. According to his authority, the counter-admiral could demand manpower as needed, and so he did. His officers and bosuns went to the surface with their teams and began recruiting from the work corps. In conflicts with the supervising officials of the Administratum, Rasiak's men simply stated that the Imperial Navy's needs had higher priority compared to the Departamento Munitorum. Before they knew it, many workers found themselves in the crews of starships. Soon, these recruits stood before the scorching gaze of cannon master captains, or were engaged in the myriad routine shipboard tasks requiring brute physical strength rather than skill. The seasoned sailors called the recruits ground rats and planet dwellers, thus emphasizing their place at the very bottom of the Imperial Navy hierarchy. Yet they helped the counter-admiral mitigate the manpower shortage. Rasiak also conducted an inspection of all cargo ships within the Vraks system. At that time, a supply convoy was being unloaded on the Arsenal world, a slow process given the absence of spaceports. Here, the counter-admiral was fortunate as the massive cargo ship Isra Moors had almost completed its unloading. The vessel was immediately requisitioned for military service. Though it was civilian, its sufficient defensive armament saw both the craft and its elderly captain incorporated into the defense fleet. There were another 5 cargo ships in the system arriving or departing. Of these, 2 were deemed sufficiently armed to engage in warfare if necessary. Rasiak bolstered the small and inexperienced crews with several of his officers, bosuns and gunners, and placed the transports under the command of his son, Flag Lieutenant Maius Rasiak. The remaining 3 ships were of no value due to their near-total lack of armament. By order of the counter-admiral, most of the crew and weapons were stripped from these cargo ships, leaving only a few volunteers. The transports were then loaded with all the explosives the Master of Artillery could procure, transforming the ships into massive bombs. The crammed cargo holds were readied for detonation and the plasma reactors were prepared for critical overload. These 3 starships will become part of the fireship squadron, with the crews tasked to seek out suitable enemy targets and ram them, thereby delivering colossal damage. The crew were instructed to abandon the ships before the ramming, but Vraks knew that survivors of such operations were scarce. Yet their sacrifice would not be in vain if fate deemed it fit to pit his fleet against the armada of chaos. The fireships could help tip the scales of battle in favor of the Imperium. In further preparations, Vraks dispatched 3 Sword-class frigates from the Exuo squadron to keep watch at the far reaches of the system, with orders to seek out invading enemies and alert the main forces of approaching danger. They were instructed not to engage with the enemy, but to return to join the other ships and take their place in the formation so that the rear admiral could face the heretics fully armed. Starships formed a battle line high above Vraks, shielded from the powerful defensive laser batteries, many of which were still in enemy hands, by the planet itself. In the front was the Lord Bellerophon, from which the rear admiral would command the battle. Behind the returning frigates from the Exuo squadron, even further back, were the defensive monitors. Most of the energy of these slow, bulky ships went to powering their weapon systems rather than engines, and it was these monitors that determined the speed of movement of the battle line. The formation was trailed by 2 armed cargo vessels, and last followed the Isra Moors. The rear admiral kept the 3 fireships in reserve. Truthfully, it was a patchwork fleet of 13 disparate ships, yet Vraks did everything possible for the defense of Vraks. Now the rear admiral and his officers prayed to the Emperor that all these preparations would not be needed. Vraks realized his prayers went unanswered when he received a critical message from Exuo 43 frigate. The ship detected a squadron of 3 starships whose energy signatures identified them as Infidel class. The frigate tracked the approach of the heretics, but remained on position in case of detecting other ships. Vraks had no doubt others would follow. The infidels were only reconnaissance, probing his defences. He could have ordered the frigates to engage the heretics, but that would leave the fleet blind at the distant approaches and might cost the loss of valuable ships. It was better to reconcile with the fact that the enemy would have a good look at his forces, but reserve them for the upcoming battle. The infidels merely hovered around the battle line hidden behind Vraks, not risking venturing into the Lord Bellerophon's gun range. They didn't even make a trial torpedo volley from long range. Instead, the Chaos frigate scanned and watched cautiously before retreating. Now the traitors knew the strength, or rather the lack thereof, of the Imperial fleet. Heretics will undoubtedly be instilled with confidence in victory and attempt to sweep away the hastily assembled Loyalist squadron. 6 days later, in the year 823 of the 41st millennium, the squadron Exuo detected a further 14 energy signatures of approaching ships from the Chaos Armada. The heretics navigated around the asteroid fields and set a course at full speed toward the center of the star system, towards Vraks Prime. Following orders, the Imperial frigates turned and, squeezing everything possible from their reactors in hopes of outpacing the traitors, hastened to join the main forces. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Vraks, issuing final instructions to all ships, quoted the opening lines of the Imperial fleet's charter for those yet inexperienced in battle. Everywhere and always, you are expected to conduct yourselves in a manner befitting the grand traditions and duties of His Imperial Majesty's glorious and honourable fleet. Our orders demand nothing less. Do your duty, gentlemen. With these words, the Lord Bellerophon activated all systems, engines roared back to life, and the hull groaned under increasing stress. Slowly, with cold majesty, the cruiser began to slip off orbit, leading the remaining ships in a column. The vessels moved so closely together that crew members on the foredecks of one ship reported feeling the vibrations from the engines of the leading vessel. The returning frigates, prudently avoiding planetary weapons, merged into the battle formation of the fleet departing from Vraks. Monitors led by tugs significantly slowed the overall progress, but Rear Admiral demanded everyone maintain order, adhere strictly to discipline, and remain vigilant. Rasiak's plan, consisting of immediate engagement, was simple and ruthless. It may have been based on the Battle of Gethsemane, meticulously studied by the Rear Admiral, in which Lord Admiral Ravensburg achieved a brilliant victory over 700 years ago, reversing the course of the Gothic War and securing himself a place of honour in the annals of the Imperial fleet. Rasiak's forces would advance in a linear battle formation tightly packed to prevent the enemy from breaking through. Under the cover of Lord Bellerophon's torpedo salvos, they would pass through the enemy fleet under fire from all sides, while simultaneously delivering massive damage to the heretics with their port and starboard weapons. At the height of the battle, the Rear Admiral would direct fire ships at the damaged enemy ships, which would be unable to evade a collision with them. The fire ships should cause sufficient chaos and panic so that, in the ensuing exchange of salvos, the Imperial ships advancing in tight formation would prevail. With luck and strict discipline, Rasiak hoped to inflict enough damage on the enemy fleet that the heretics would deem it wiser to retreat rather than continue their advance. Thus, hour by hour, the fleet of the Rear Admiral continued to slowly move towards the approaching forces of chaos at Vraks. As the two fleets drew closer, the assembled ship crews of Rasiak took their battle stations. Sailors loaded additional ammunition for each broadside weapon. Workers sealed bulkheads and hatches to prevent the spread of imminent fires. On the command deck of the Lord Bellerophon, far from the gunnery decks, the Rear Admiral, Flag Captain Droster, and the command staff in silent calm watched the screens upon which logisticians fed streams of technical information. Meanwhile, the ship priests roamed the corridors and halls, chanting hymns, litanies, and blessing the guns along with their crews. They all must stand firm, and then the Emperor would surely protect them. The crews below decks were unaware that the fleet of traitors whose energy signatures burned brightly on the auger screens of the Lord Bellerophon was already racing toward them. Caution was no longer needed. They now pounced upon their prey like a bloodthirsty predator, consumed by hunger and eager to kill. Rasiak demanded the augurs focus on the heretic's lead ship and direct the information to his command pulpit above the bridge deck. Taking a closer look at the stream of runes, the Rear Admiral was deeply troubled, realizing what they faced. The Lord Bellerophon was a powerful weapon, a cruiser, a mighty line ship, yet before them appeared something entirely different. From the depths of space at full speed, a monster was set on an intercept course towards the Imperials, a true Leviathan from the abyss. Without a doubt, it was a despoiler-class battleship, or at the very least something comparable. Despoilers were considered nearly legend among the officers of the battle fleet Obscurus. Among the largest ships ever built, they possessed enough firepower to obliterate cities and carried squadrons of assault fighters and bombers. The Imperial cruiser could not engage this monster with any hope of victory. "Emperor preserve us," murmured Rasiak, abruptly aware that he was destined to die, and the fleet to become a heap of space debris. The Rear Admiral was disheartened. Was this truly his duty? No one demanded he commit suicide in a hopeless battle. Would he still have time to give the order to retreat? Should he preserve the ships and surrender Vraks to the heretics' mercy? Rasiak could flee, power down, and lie in wait at the edge of the system, hoping to return with a more powerful fleet to defeat such a formidable foe. While Rasiak wavered between his duty to stand to the last and the realization that it was a futile endeavour, Flag Captain Droster approached the pulpit and reported, "Rear Admiral, the enemy fleet has changed course." Rasiak could not decide whether to continue the assault. Would it be a foolish gesture, or what duty, honour and rank demanded of him? "The heretics' lead ship is turning left. They've split their formation." Rasiak hesitated. Captain Drost awaited orders. "Our ships are awaiting orders, sir," he reminded his commander. The Rear Admiral looked at him. "To me, Flag Captain, sometimes the demands of duty seem like a futile gesture against a universe that craves our obliteration. I believe today we shall meet our ancestors alongside the Emperor." We had better prove ourselves worthy to join their glorious company. Maintain current course and speed, and fire a salvo from all torpedo tubes at maximum range." Vraks regained his confidence and courage. The rear admiral did not need to hear the message, torpedoes away. He, like everyone on board, felt the rumble and shudder as the torpedoes left the tubes. Directly ahead of the Lord Bellerophon, the enemies indeed divided their forces. 5 spacecraft, led by the Heart of Anarchy, a despoiler-class battleship, were executing a turn maneuver to port. A larger cluster of 9 ships of various types and sizes, spearheaded by the Blood Dawn, a Styx-class cruiser, prepared to pass on the starboard side of the Imperials. Vraks' artillery crews would face challenges in selecting from the multitude of targets on each flank. The rear admiral ordered Drost to relay to the gunnery team's captains to adjust their aims. Given the enemy's numerical superiority, every shot counted. The first torpedo salvo headed forward, launched in a fan pattern, considering the numerous enemy vessels that immediately began evasive maneuvers. From the Lord Bellerophon, they closely monitored the torpedo's course as they neared the heretics. The first missed the Heart of Anarchy, while the second detonated against void shields, causing no visible damage. The third was shot down by defensive batteries, and the fourth exploded in space due to a malfunction. The fifth sailed near an Iconoclast-class destroyer, escorting the battleship. The small ship was nimble enough to move out of the torpedo's path. The sixth caused a surge of elation on the command bridge as it struck the second Iconoclast squarely. The torpedo's internal logic systems adjusted its course at the last moment, steering it directly into the maneuvering target. The melter warhead detonated with monstrous force, instantly collapsing the small ship's void shields and blowing a massive hole in its stern. The vessel was now belching plasma, a sure sign of reactor damage. The mortally wounded Iconoclast fell out of formation, drifting helplessly as it awaited critical overload in its reactor, destined to become space debris. "First blood for the big hackmaster!" Flag Captain Drost exclaimed with joy, though the celebration of this minor victory dissipated as the cruiser shook and shuddered under the traitor's return salvos. The Ravager unleashed its heavy weapons. The void shield generators of Lord Bellerophon howled in protest as powerful broadsides crashed down upon the cruiser. Still outside its effective combat range, the Luna bore the heretic's fire upon itself. Beams from laser turrets flickered in the void, while plasma cannons left sun-dimming blooms of explosions along the ship's length. Deep within the cruiser, overloaded void shield capacitors exploded in showers of sparks and molten metal in attempts to hold back the heretic's firepower. Small but rapidly spreading fires broke out following their destruction. For now, hull damage was minimal. In response, Vraks ordered the fleet to close in with the enemy to return fire. The two fleets glided past each other in a deadly artillery battle. Now a second line of enemy ships approached from the starboard side, heralded by swarms of bombers and fighters that filled the void between the armadas. Icons of enemy targets flooded the ship's surveyor screens. Every gun and turret of the Lord Bellerophon fired, and with each salvo the ship shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. The roar escalated. On the gun decks, it was impossible to hear the chief gunners and battery captains' orders over the din of high-energy lance batteries with macro cannons. Under the strokes of the bosun's whips, the untrained crew laboured sweatily to return guns thrown off by the recoil to starting positions. Shells so heavy that at least 10 men were required to move them were loaded into the gun breeches. The unending gunfire thickened the air with toxic fumes. The temperature kept rising from the strain on power modules, and the gun barrels glowed white-hot. Cooling systems overheated, and ship crews struggled mightily to cool the weapons to improve their firing accuracy. Similar scenes played out on all Imperial ships in the battle formation. Swords added their firepower to the fray, exchanging shots with enemy escorts, while monitors focused their fire on the larger Chaos vessels. Like belligerent warhounds descending upon a grow, they unleashed upon them with unexpected ferocity from such unassuming ships. The void of space filled with flashes, explosions and streaks of beams in a fierce firefight. For both sides, it was a furious duel, and each suffered losses. Heart of Anarchy swept with broadside fire along the entire Imperial line, crushing void shields and armor with its furious might as it advanced. The enemy battleship's batteries dealt irreparable damage to Xu-41, which now drifted, consumed by raging fires on all decks. The frigate's command staff were entirely incinerated on the command bridge due to multiple lance hits that destroyed the superstructure. 2 monitors also failed to survive the battle. The plasma reactors of the first exploded like a new sun, leaving behind only an expanding cloud of cosmic dust. The second was shot to complete destruction by traitors' guns, turning the monitor into a drifting hulk. Miraculously, both armed cargo ships breached the enemy line, yet none emerged unscathed. The void shields vanished, the decks were engulfed in flames, losses were high, but the transports were still able to continue moving. The Isra Moors lost 3 plasma reactors due to raids from Chaos bombers and was operating at minimal power. Lacking maneuverability, the ship became a target for gunfire, forcing Vraks to abandon it to its fate. Instead of abandoning the vessel, the captain of the Isra Moors ordered the surviving crew members to take up the guns and continue firing. The Lord Bellerophon itself faced hardships as well. Its guns damaged the Chaos heavy transport Bane of Aharon and destroyed another iconoclast. 2 gun decks of the port side burned to the ground, and firefighting teams struggled to contain the spreading fire. The main communications tower was torn off. Most of the void shield generators were overloaded and had to be shut down to avoid the risk of explosion. One of the plasma reactors was living its final moments after a salvo of macro cannons pierced engine room number 2. Most of the tech priests nearby perished in the explosions that followed the hits. Among other things, the Lord Bellerophon had 2 hull breaches, and several decks exposed to the vacuum after direct lance hits had to be isolated. The old warship was battered and riddled with wounds, yet it still fought on. The Chaos fleet also suffered losses, yet for unknown reasons 2 of the traitor cruisers had yet to enter the fray. They held in the rear guard of the second battle line, and glancing at the console of his pulpit, Vraks saw them breaking away, seemingly withdrawing from battle. It was a glimmer of luck. Possibly the forces of Chaos were leaving the field, yet their guns could easily finish off the Lord Bellerophon with its escort. Having lost nearly all means of communication, the counter-admiral was unaware that reinforcements were already en route. The battle fleet Scarus had dispatched the nearest combat-ready flotilla to Vraks. The cruiser group Mazur, under the command of Counter-Admiral Titus Mazur, emerged from the warp in the rear of the enemy fleet. A flotilla composed of the Consul Thracian cruiser of the Gothic class, Orion of the Dictator class, the ancient Grand Cruiser Oathbound, and an escort squadron rushed toward Vraks and the raging battle. Having combined their forces, the Imperials could tip the scales in their favor. The first to detect the new threat were the cruisers from the rear guard of the Chaos Armada, which immediately set a new course for interception. It so happened that both counter-admirals were well acquainted with each other. Both had graduated from the same cadet academy on Cypra Mundi and shared remarkably similar careers. They harbored a mutual dislike and had a long history of adversarial contests. Vraks had once stood as second for a young officer whom Mazur challenged to a duel and subsequently killed. Now fate had once again brought these 2 into the heat of battle. Vraks was unaware of reinforcements and would only learn of them when a connection with Mazur's ships was established via the frigate Xu-43. For now, however, Vraks faced more pressing issues. Mazur's objective was to cut off the heretic fleet's approach to Vraks and prevent a planetary landing. His ships pushed to the limits of their capabilities, squeezing every ounce of energy from their reactors. However, he decided to leave Vraks' group to their fate, calculating that while the enemy's attention was diverted, he would reach the planet first. 2 Chaos cruisers moved to intercept Mazur's ships, and as the first skirmish concluded, a new battle ignited. The fallen son of the Slaughter class and Ferrum Invictus of the Desolation class executed a sharp turn, deploying assault fighters and opening fire with their long-range batteries. Mazur could ill afford delay due to the enemy attack, yet ignoring them was not an option. Risking dividing his forces, the counter-admiral ordered the escort squadron and the Orion to engage with the traitors, while the remaining cruisers continued toward Vraks. Meanwhile, Rasiak ordered the remaining ships to regroup. His formation was spread out, and the damaged craft began to assemble for another run. Due to the constant threat posed by the Chaos Fleet's smaller escort ships, Rasiak could not afford to lower his guard. The regrouping process was slow, considering the damage suffered by the Imperial ships. Fortunately, the Heart of Anarchy and Bane of Aharon turned toward Vraks, intending to drop their deadly cargo on the planet. At least the battleship was now beyond the reach of the Chaos guns, even if this meant that the siege regiments on the planet's surface would have to deal with the consequences. The Blood Dawn maneuvered to launch recharged assault craft, while the Terror Claws headed towards the immobilized Isra Moors, intending to seize the massive transport as a prize. It was at this moment that Rasiak threw his reserves into the fray, 3 fire ships. The first was aimed at the Blood Dawn, while the other 2 targeted the ships heading for the planet. This was a risky venture, attempting to ram the enemy's largest starships in hopes of decisively turning the battle in their favor. The first fire ship never reached the Blood Dawn. The transport drew too much enemy fire and exploded along with its crew in the void of deep space, inflicting no damage. The second was struck by a salvo from the Heart of Anarchy and detonated near its target. The third, despite being hit, managed to break through the barrage of fire and, initiating reactor overload, headed towards the Bane of Aharon. The massive transport, once long ago a merchant ship, was crammed with thousands of soldiers ready to land on Vraks. Dozens of thousands of screaming chaos worshippers, fanatics, mutants, beastmen, renegades, and other rabble of the universe crowded in its holds. Already nearing orbit, the cumbersome transport could not perform evasive maneuvers, and the fire ship approached like a lightning strike. The crew of the Imperial ship ignored orders to abandon the vessel to precisely guide the fire ship into the heart of the Bane of Aharon. The fire ship crashed into the stern of the heretic vessel. The hull of the ancient merchant ship crumpled and broke under the impact of the Imperial spacecraft, crashing through decks and gnawing its way to the engine room. In an instant, catastrophic explosions tore away the entire rear section of the Chaos transport. The overall destruction was compounded by the critical overload of the plasma reactors, resulting in clouds of debris littering the orbit from the dying ship of the traitors. Far below, on the surface of Vraks, the guardsmen saw a new star flare up in the sky, illuminating the battlefield brightly. Without engines to overcome inertia and becoming completely uncontrollable as a result of the collision, the massive transport wavered and crumbled in high orbit. The ship, already caught by the gravitational well of Vraks, began to fall to the planet. On the bridge of the Lord Bellerophon, they watched with exultation the deadly fall of the Bane of Aharon, now spitting flames from the aft decks. Burning up in the upper layers of the atmosphere, the transport rushed towards the ground despite all efforts of the surviving crew to regain control. Would the hull endure such extreme stresses, or would the spacecraft burn and break apart in the atmosphere? The stricken heretic vessel turned into a fiery comet. From the planet's surface, it appeared as a blazing trail streaking across the heavens. The transport burst into the atmosphere, yet the armoured bow of the ship remained undamaged, and behind the thick layer of ceramite, the internal structure stayed safe. By a stroke of fate, and undoubtedly not without the influence of the dark gods, the Bane of Aharon did not disintegrate when passing through the upper atmospheric layers. As it plummeted, the heretic vessel literally shattered to pieces, yet deep within the sealed cargo bays, the mad followers of the Chaos Gods prayed to their dark masters. Despite the nightmarish damage, the crew managed to partially regain control, and thanks to a miracle granted by the gods, the ship found enough energy to alter its descent trajectory. The planet's surface quickly approached, yet the Bane of Aharon was designed to withstand the perils of warp travel, and its hull was old but exceptionally resilient. The Chaos transport crashed into the ground not far from the Chalia Plateau, carving a massive furrow on the surface of Vraks and raising a cloud of dust visible across half the planet. Like the strike of a meteor, the Bane of Aharon formed a massive crater, skidding on its belly to its final resting place. The smoking, twisted heap of steel resembled the skeleton of some ancient sea leviathan. The risen dust cloud was too dense to see anything through it. The debris of the crashed vessel littered the planet's surface for many kilometers around. Inside the ship, many traitors perished in the crash landing, but many more survived. And now, hordes of deranged, gasping and stunned Chaos worshippers slowly began to crawl onto the war-torn grounds of Vraks. Aboard the Lord Bellerophon, the elation of the successful detonation of the fireship was quickly overshadowed by the realization that the Bane of Aharon was about to crash into the planet. The officers on the bridge monitored the descent of the traitor's ship until they lost its signal in the storm-filled atmosphere. Could the ship survive such a landing? Only under the most unfavorable circumstances. Rear Admiral Raziak called the personnel to order. Despite the fate of the Bane of Aharon, the Imperials still needed to win the battle. The remnants of the fleet regrouped as he endeavored to establish contact with Rear Admiral Mazur to coordinate a joint assault. The enemy was not yet vanquished, but neither were the Loyalists. During the fall of the Bane of Aharon, the Heart of Anarchy descended to the lower orbit and began releasing hundreds of drop pods and shuttles onto the surface of Vraks. The Alpha Legion assembled its allies, a multitude of gangs eager for pillage and slaughter. A rain of terror claws fell upon Vraks, deploying Chaos Space Marines onto the battlefield. Rear Admiral Mazur realized it was already too late to attempt to halt the heretics' landing operation. Yet he still charged toward Vraks, hoping to intercept and destroy the Heart of Anarchy, a deed worthy of the highest accolades in the Imperial Navy. Behind them, the Orion engaged two enemy cruisers. Supported by sword-class frigates from the Nares patrol squadron, the Imperial cruiser exchanged broadsides with the foes. The macro-cannons pounded the heretics' void shields while squadrons of assault craft engaged in dogfights with enemy bombers and fighters. As the range closed and the salvos struck the hulls of the ships, the Orion lost two escort frigates. A well-aimed hit from potent lances cleaved the first frigate in two. The second perished during an approach to the Ferrum Invictus, bravely continuing to fire until the last moment as enemy bombers mercilessly obliterated deck after deck. Many crew members were sucked into space, turning the ship into yet another drifting hulk. The Orion itself sustained several breaches, and damaged cooling pipes filled the starboard hangars with scalding steam. With all fighter squadrons on sortie, the ship found itself in mortal danger. The Ferrum Invictus began preparing to launch boarding pods to seize the beleaguered cruiser. Left to fight an uneven battle, the captain of the Orion informed the officers that they had fulfilled their duty and role in the engagement. Enemy cruisers were embroiled in conflict, leaving the pursuit of Rear Admiral Mazur's group, but now the Orion was severely damaged and at risk of being captured by the enemy. Instead of continuing the hopeless fight, the captain gave the order to withdraw from the battle. The Imperial ship, along with the only surviving frigate, shut down power to the engines and augers, then ceased fire. While the Chaos forces continued to search for their target, the Orion set a course for evasion and disappeared into the outskirts of the system. Rear Admiral Mazur accepted the retreat of the cruiser as it had accomplished its task and bought time for the approach towards Vraks and the Heart of Anarchy. The battle was nearing its final stage, and the Orion could not make a significant contribution from its distant position. At least now the vessel will survive to participate in the forthcoming battles. Meanwhile, the immobilized Isra Mors was ultimately lost. It resisted desperately, but the Bloody Dawn possessed overwhelming superiority in firepower. Chaos worshipper boarding pods bit into the sides of the Imperial ship, and soon the corridors were filled with the clamour and smoke of furious close-quarters combat. The traitors carved a bloody path through the crew of the merchant vessel. Many were trapped and chose to surrender, resigning themselves to being slaves on the Bloody Dawn. The transport ship's captain launched a desperate counterattack, but could not repel the heretics who outnumbered him. Skirmishes in the corridors and halls continued for a whole hour, with people using any weapon they could find at hand. Eventually, the command bridge was captured, marking the transition of the Imperial ship into full control by chaos. Observing the advance of Mazur's two cruisers, Rear Admiral Vraks reactivated the systems of his battle-scarred ship. He demanded his tech priest Majoria find any available power to restore void shields and weapons. Vraks faced the prospect of clashing once more with the bloody Dawn and Heart of Anarchy, with almost no chance that the Lord Bellerophon could endure such damage again. Remaining vessels were ordered to follow the flagship. Behind the ship lined the last monitor, 2 armed transport ships, and a frigate. As Vraks listened to reports coming through the static and interference of the Vox transmitter about the status of ships, the Lord Bellerophon was suddenly shaken by a shockwave, and an ominous creak spread across the bridge. Clutching to his pulpit, the Rear Admiral saw officers feverishly receiving damage reports. The flagship continued to slowly list, bulkheads groaning under the strain caused by the mass displacement of the massive ship. Reports flooded the command bridge. They had lost the main maneuvering engines numbered 3 and 4. A sudden strike was dealt by an unnoticed torpedo, possibly one that had previously shut down due to a malfunction or strategically launched from a long distance by a lurking Chaos Raider. The Lord Bellerophon was seriously damaged. Without engines, the flagship could not lead the smaller vessels into battle against the battleship and heavy cruiser, which already separated the Imperial fleet from Vraks. Now 2 of Mazur's ships went into battle unsupported. Vraks sent a message to the Consul Thraciae about his withdrawal from the battle and his intention to leave the system at maximum possible speed. The Consul Thraciae of Rear Admiral Mazur was left with only the cover of the lone Covenant. The destruction of the engines of the Lord Bellerophon radically changed the balance of power in favour of the traitors. They still had 4 capital ships at their disposal, including a battleship and a heavy cruiser. The Imperial Navy could oppose these forces with only 2 cruisers. It was obvious that the Loyalists had lost the Vraks system. When news of the Lord Bellerophon's withdrawal from battle reached the captain of the Covenant, he requested permission to abort the upcoming attack on the Heart of Anarchy and begin a retreat. Rear Admiral Mazur realized he had arrived too late to save the situation and approved the retreat of the Covenant, but not his own. It seemed to him that by refusing to support the attack, Vraks had betrayed him. Vraks had not fulfilled his duty as an officer of the Imperial Navy, and Mazur gave instructions to the captain of the Covenant to convey these considerations to the leadership on Cypra Mundi. Perhaps Rear Admiral Vraks would survive this battle, but he would have to pay for failure with his career. Mazur did not intend to return with his tail between his legs. His only chance for glory was the destruction of the Heart of Anarchy. The Emperor himself stood beside the Rear Admiral when he ordered the Consul Thraciae to ram speed. Mazur's bravery bordered on folly, as the Imperial ship entered the lethal range of enemy fire, including the planetary laser batteries of Vraks. Soon, the traitors were pounding the cruiser from all sides. The Heart of Anarchy locked the approaching flagship within the sights of its most powerful lances and batteries. Meter-thick plates on the bow armour of the Consul Thraciae evaporated under the barrage of energy beams. The ship's captain demanded the attack be halted immediately, as the cruiser had no chance of reaching its target. Most of the void shield generators were already destroyed. Mazur ordered the ship's commissar to arrest the captain and personally took command of the Consul Thraciae. His decision to ram the enemy battleship was an act from which Imperial Navy legends are born. It was a heroic but doomed attack that cost the Scarus battle fleet its magnificent Gothic-class cruiser, as well as the lives of the Rear Admiral and the entire crew. Cadets on Cypra Mundi to this day debate whether the attack on the heretics' battleship was the pinnacle of bravery or an unforgivable folly. Even though Mazur's ship was being torn apart, no order was given to abandon the vessel. However, escape pods and any machines fit for flight began to disperse from the Imperial cruiser. Many would fall captive to the heretical forces, but others would be drawn into the gravitational well of Vraks, joining the barrage of landing craft and pods descending onto the planet. The counter-admiral remained on the command deck even as fires raged around him. A junior adjutant attempted to drag Matsur away, but he refused to leave his post, standing at attention as if on parade before the cadets. His mind clouded, and soon the counter-admiral was engulfed in flame. The Thracian consul became yet another dead, drifting hulk. The battle transformed the space around the planet into a veritable graveyard of ships. The debris and hulks of 11 Imperial starships littered the entire orbit. The list of losses was depressingly long. The Thracian consul was lost, the largest ship destroyed, along with 4 sword-class frigates, 2 defense monitors, and the heavy cargo transport, Isra Mors, with all its fireships. In addition, every surviving vessel sustained serious damage. The Lord Bellerophon, for instance, would require years of repair work and rearmament before it could stand in line again. A similar situation befell the Orion. Only the Hallowed suffered minor damage and could continue to serve. From the enemy fleet, the loss of the Bane of Aharon and at least 4 Iconoclast and Infidel-class raiders was confirmed. Nevertheless, the heretics gained full control over the system. The Bloody Dawn unleashed the Terror Claws upon Vraks, teeming with corn-worshipping berserkers, including the infamous Scalathrax berserkers and the Skulltakers gang, led by the warlord Jufa, the Blood Raider, rumoured to be a trusted lieutenant of Abaddon the Despoiler. In total, tens of thousands of new soldiers descended upon Vraks, chanting sacrilegious and blasphemous prayers and thirsting to kill in the name of the dark gods. The Ferrum Invictus landed a large band of iron warriors, whose expertise in siege and trench warfare would prove extremely useful to the defending heretics on the planet. The defeat in the battle for Vraks would hit the Death Corps fighting on the planet first, exacting a high and bloody toll. Ultimately, it would cost them victory, which after a decade of trench warfare seemed so close. Chapter 8. Breakout of the Stalemate. For these people there is no after Vraks. Commissar Obiansk, 19th Siege Regiment. The main obstacle. In the year 822 of the 41st millennium, the 468th Siege Regiment broke the resistance of the second line of defence, and the tide of Imperials surged forward as if through a breached dam. As the Krieg forces advanced on all fronts, the traitors were forced to retreat or risk the possibility of entrapment, which would mean inevitable annihilation. Leaving rearguards to cover their retreat, the enemies fell back to the inner line of defence, where they were to make their last stand. Encircling the Vraks citadel for 150 kilometres, the inner echelon of defence was not a simple trench system, but a band of formidable fortifications 8 kilometres deep. It was denser than the 2 previous lines of fortifications, which had taken a full 9 years to capture. The inner line was the oldest and finest part of the citadel's defences. Since Vrax's colonisation as an arsenal world and the construction of multiple Departmenta Munitorum warehouses, the Imperium had been building up its defences to protect valuable military resources. Previous planetary governors and overseers from the Administratum systematically added new elements to the defence system as the necessity for enhancing security measures became apparent with the construction of new underground vaults. The fortifications themselves included a well-planned network of trenches, bunkers, casemates, pillboxes, sunken gun positions, and redoubts. Underground lay a labyrinthine system of shelters and bomb shelters, reliably shielded from enemy artillery. All defence elements had overlapping fields of fire, and the approaches to them were veritable kill zones. As before, the defence belts were surrounded by strands of barbed wire, thousands of tank traps, and dense minefields. Unlike the 2 previous echelons, the last line was shielded by planetary laser batteries. Their main task was to protect the citadel with its spaceport from orbital attack. These massive lasers could attack enemy spacecraft, but could also be used as heavy artillery against ground targets. The beam gun's range was sufficient to fire on the advancing Death Corps, and the shafts housing the batteries would inevitably come within range of the Krieg's heavy guns. However, the fortifications were constructed with orbital bombardment in mind, and it was unlikely that ground guns could disable the laser batteries. All these factors made the prospect of an assault daunting. Worse still, Cardinal Zaphan's forces had a whole decade to fortify their positions and calibrate their guns. Before its sudden fall into the hands of heretics, Vraks was considered an impregnable world. Only the Imperium, with its indomitable might and inexhaustible human and military resources, could dare a frontal assault. Even so, the unbeatable war machine of the Imperial Guard required a decade, as well as 4 million dead, not counting the many times greater number of wounded, just to break through to the inner line of fortifications. Many among the high command of the 88th Siege Army believed that now they faced the main obstacle. The inner defensive line had been continuously reinforced and modernized since the very founding of the Arsenal world. Ahead lay the main fortress wall, behind which on a volcanic promontory stood the citadel itself, the nerve centre of Vraks. Both were excellently protected. However, they were static targets, and as such could be obliterated by artillery fire. The inner defensive line was not a singular target, and the siege regiments at the front line would have to advance slowly, wearing down the enemy and paying a high price for every captured scrap of land. The command assumed that once the last defensive line was breached, the fortress wall with the citadel wouldn't hold out for long. Scant achievements. Zwelka, the supreme commander of the 88th Siege Army, was closely observing the campaign's progress from the Thracian Primaris, fully understanding that he had been given only 12 years to conquer Vraks. 12 years of full support from the Departamento Munitorum in the form of supplies and reinforcements. The campaign was brutally simple and meticulously designed, with great attention to logistics and disregard for the inevitable losses. He had only 3 years left to successfully complete the assigned objective. Given the current situation, none of the staff officers seriously believed they would meet the deadline. No one knew what would happen once the allotted time expired. Most likely the war would end in failure and defeat. As supply priorities would be reassessed, regiments recalled to other theatres of war, and maintaining pressure on the enemy would no longer be possible. The prospect of ultimate victory would vanish, and the 88th Siege Army would find itself trapped in a war it could not win. Cardinal Zaphan might not have realized that for triumph he only needed to hold out for 3 more years. His troops had also suffered in the nightmare of trench warfare and incurred significant losses, but still managed to find the strength to endure the burden of 9 years of total war. They offered defensive battles, exhausting the forces of the Imperium while minimizing their own losses. The heretics had reserves men and the will to fight to the last drop of blood at their disposal. Before Zwelka, the main problem loomed large. Time was against him, and a new offensive needed to be launched promptly. Yet commanders reported that after breaching the second echelon of defense, the Imperial forces were worn out to the limit. The losses in material and manpower were colossal, and the enemy continued to resist at times with fanatical stubbornness. To resume the offensive on the next line of trenches and bunkers meant driving men to certain death with no hope of victory. The Imperials lacked the power to achieve any significant breakthrough. The 18 siege regiments of the 88th Army needed time to entrench, rearm, and restore their strength for a new assault on the rebels' fortifications. While they continued to exhaust the enemy with artillery bombardments, trench raids, and minor attacks, it was impossible to launch a full-scale offensive. Undoubtedly, this temporary lull also gave the heretics time to recover, regroup, and strengthen their defences. Having lost hope for an immediate offensive, the Death Corps continued their slow but relentless advance. Now having room for engineering operations, the Krieg troops surrounded the inner defence line with a dense network of trenches. Enemy artillery posed a constant threat to the engineers, but work proceeded day and night, and after weeks the landscape of Vraks was covered with labyrinths of shelters, bunkers and supply trenches stretching to the former second line of the heretics' defences. Thanks to this, it was possible to avoid using service roads that were under constant targeted fire from enemy batteries. The assault on the Mortuary Ridge. In Sector 558, 470, the 468th Regiment of the 46th Line Corps, holding the right flank, found itself in a difficult tactical situation. Their sector of the front faced a small mountain ridge with a shallow valley, beyond which the enemy observed from their positions. Clearly, this location was not ideal for long-term defence, as it exposed the Loyalists' forward elements to the heretics' devastating fire. The Krieg troops faced two choices: either withdraw to a safe distance, thereby giving the enemy a no-man's land that would later have to be stormed again, or drive the enemy from the mountain ridge. The command of the 88th Army demanded the 468th Regiment to move forward and take the traitors' positions. Several ridges stretched southeast from this sector, each of which had to be captured, as they gave the rebels visibility and the ability to fire for kilometres around. The first position to be assaulted was grimly dubbed Mortuary Ridge by the Guardsmen, with their typical sombre outlook on life. Unable to conduct a full-scale offensive, it was decided to focus efforts on small, close combat skirmishes with limited objectives. Initially, the 468th Regiment would not deepen into the enemy's defensive belt, but merely attempt to dislodge the heretics from the commanding heights. To cut off the enemy from reinforcements and prevent their regrouping, neighbouring regiments would launch diversionary attacks. The offensive would be conducted by 5 companies in the first wave along a 4-kilometre front, with 2 more in reserve. From the left flank, 2 other companies of the 468th Regiment would support the main forces with fire. After numerous battles, none of these units were at full strength, and some had less than half their men remaining. The operation was scheduled to commence in the year 823 of the 41st millennium, when the tanks of the 72nd Company would move out to aid the main Imperial forces. In the 72nd Company itself, only 4 Lehman Russ tanks remained operational, but requests for the deployment of heavy armoured vehicles were also sent to other units. The key to the success of the offensive will be artillery support. All regimental guns have been prepared for the impending operation to lay down enfilade fire, aiming to completely isolate the area from the arrival of enemy reinforcements. In total, 360 guns will bombard the heretics, though due to recent intensive battles, many lacked ammunition. The heavy artillery fire has lost its accuracy due to severe barrel wear and the constant breakdown of the recoil mechanisms. After the preliminary bombardment, mortars will lay down a smoke screen in front of the soldiers and tanks crossing the fire-swept slope. As they advance, autocannons and heavy stubbers will provide covering fire over the guardsmen's heads to suppress enemy heavy weapon emplacements. The heretics' positions atop the mortuary ridge were well defended. The forward trench comprised numerous bunkers and pillboxes. Besides bomb shelters, the defensive line bristled with bunkers, tank traps, minefields, and tangles of barbed wire. To the left of the attack zone, there was a cluster of defensive installations, provisionally designated as Fort C-585, as well as another fortified position named Mortuary Redoubt. Enemy artillery was stationed on the rear slope of the ridge, ready to commence a counter-bombardment on no man's land. At the forefront stood the 31st, 33rd, 53rd, 54th, and 68th Infantry Companies of the 468th Regiment. The 31st Company was tasked with clearing the Mortuary Redoubt, while the heavy burden of advancing on Fort C-585 fell upon the 54th. Their attack will be supported by available tanks, including 2 heavy Macharius tanks, brought in from the reserve companies to demolish fortifications. The commencement of the offensive was scheduled for the 823rd year of the 41st millennium, and in the hours leading up to the attack, the forward trenches began filling with assault platoons. Guardsmen were issued additional grenades and ammunition, and quartermasters conducted a final roll call, preparing to follow the grim lines of attackers and collect any abandoned equipment. In the 823rd year of the 41st millennium, the preliminary artillery barrage began. The sky was streaked with traces of shells, followed by huge bombard high-explosive rounds crashing down on enemy pillboxes and bunkers. Captain Foda, commander of the 54th Company, observed through a periscope from his trench as his target was engulfed in plumes of smoke and flame. The bombardment rolled a wall of fire across the rebel positions and surged further into the rear positions, scorching the earth and pulverizing the fortifications into dust. The devastating bombardment continued, even as the forward mortar detachments began deploying smoke screens over no man's land. The Imperials watched as clouds of smoke thickened, covering the battlefield in an impenetrable grey shroud. The time had come. Sergeants began shouting orders, and the guardsmen's booted feet clattered up the parapet ladders. Stooped figures methodically marched across no man's land before vanishing into the smoke screen. The engines of the tanks roared back to life, and the machines surged forward to support the infantry. When the guardsmen advanced, the artillery fell silent, and it was the rebels' turn to open return fire. What was happening in the smoke was impossible to discern from the rear. On the right flank, the 33rd Company advanced further than the others, bypassing the mortuary redoubt, but consequently came under crossfire from heavy bolters and stubbers to the left. The soldiers sought refuge in craters, and the commander was killed immediately after the first salvos from the heretics. The 31st Company fought its way to the perilous redoubt and also suffered from the crossfire. Soon the enemy initiated a mortar bombardment with incendiary shells that bloomed into orange-yellow explosions, scattering oxygen phosphorus gel in all directions, burning through clothing and skin alike. The fire was targeted, forcing the forward platoons of the 31st Company to go to ground. In the centre, the situation for the 52nd Company was scarcely better, and even under constant fire, the forward platoons crawled toward the heretics' trenches. Before the 54th Company loomed a mighty fort, where artillery fire reached its highest concentration. The ground was littered with craters, and one of the Lehman Russ tanks was already bogged down. The immobilized tank transformed into a stationary firing point, sending shell after shell towards the fort. The infantry clustered around the remaining vehicles, slowly advancing. Emerging from the smoke curtain, the guardsmen came under crossfire from enemy emplacements and bunkers. Supporting advancing tanks maneuvered between craters to reach positions as swiftly as possible. The first, Macarius, riddled with laser burns and bullet holes, returned fire with its twin-linked cannons, levelling the traitors' trenches. The second, Macarius, attempted to push toward the enemy, but an artillery shell detonated in close proximity to the tank. The explosion's force shredded the vehicle's right tread, leaving the armoured colossus stranded in no man's land. Things were not going well for the armoured vehicles crawling over the scorched earth. The second, Lehman Russ, struck a mine, and its crew, hastily abandoning the smouldering hulk, perished under the fire of heavy stubbers. On the left flank of the advance, the guardsmen of the 65th Company were overcoming the steepest section of the ridge under mortar bombardment from the heretics. Meanwhile, 2 reserve companies had already moved up to the forward Imperial trenches, ready to rush into the attack on command, and from the rear, a company of Death Riders arrived, awaiting an opportunity to exploit the advance's success. The battle raged on throughout the day. Artillery shells roared and thundered as both sides tried to counter with bombardments of their own. In the centre, the 53rd Company successfully reached the trenches of the traitors and was now clearing them with grenades and bayonets. It seemed the rebels had retreated to their fortified positions. More platoons surged into the attack, hoping to build on the initial success and fend off the inevitable counterattack. More manpower and heavy weaponry were required if the Imperials hoped to hold the newly captured positions. A battery of quad-gun emplacements was dispatched for support, but it fell under enemy artillery fire, and having lost all its Centaur transports, was left to rust in no man's land. Heretics launched a counter-offensive in a human wave, charging at the guardsmen from the cover of a second defensive line. Screaming and howling, the cultists surged through the laser fire and leapt into the trenches. The soldiers clashed in ferocious hand-to-hand combat, killing each other with swords, axes, bayonets and bare hands. In the chaotic melee, the company commander was pierced in the chest with a bayonet and left to die. The Krieg soldiers who did not retreat were either slaughtered or captured, and the trench was once again seized by the traitors. At Fort C-585, Captain Foda took cover behind the smoking hull of a Macarius, directing the forward platoons and attempting to identify targets among the enemy positions for the mortar crews. The smokescreen had dissipated, yet clouds of thick dust still billowed over the battlefield, and the sky began gradually turning grey, heralding the onset of the notoriously infamous Vraksian rains. A stray bullet ricocheted off the tank, hitting the captain's helmet and throwing him off balance. Fortunately, he avoided injury. Collecting himself, Fodor saw the lone surviving Macarius obliterate a fortified ferrocrete bunker and its adjacent wall with a direct hit. The tank charged through the breach, suppressing the enemy with heavy bolter fire, while its crew feverishly reloaded the main guns. The captain signalled the leading squads and rose from cover with his command squad. Drawing a las pistol from his holster, he led the guardsmen in an attack, inspiring them with his example. Inch by inch, crater by crater, they advanced toward their objective. Soon the Kriegs were already throwing grenades into the enemy trenches and shelters. Heretics still defended their dugouts and bunkers. Seeking cover, Fodor slipped into a crater, where the bodies of 5 guardsmen torn apart by shrapnel already lay. The objective was within reach. If only he had a few more squads, he could capture the strongpoint. Calling for the Vox operator, Fodor saw him blown into the air, losing a leg to a landmine. The captain crawled to the moaning, grievously wounded soldier, reached for the Voxcaster, and requested support. "Send the second wave of guardsmen and the objective will be secured," he transmitted to command. While Fodor fought for his life, the intensity of the bombardment began to decline as the artillerymen settled into rhythm. In the Krieg trenches, the soldiers of the second wave were still reorganizing and distributing additional equipment when an urgent order to advance came through. The watchmasters got the men on their feet, and the guardsmen crowded around the parapets, climbing into no man's land one after another. Only a few of Fodor's soldiers managed to reach Fort C-585. Digging into enemy trenches and defending the flanks, they most deeply drove into the enemy's defences. And now, as in previous instances, the advance began to stifle under the torrential fire of the heretics. The second wave rolled across the wastelands like a grey tide. The Kriegs ducked from the ongoing artillery bombardment. Assault squads rushed forward, paying no heed to the lagging and wounded comrades cut down by the rebels' aimed fire. Soon they reached Fodor's positions, and fixing bayonets, rushed towards Fort C-585. Many perished, but even more reached the enemy trenches and fortifications. The Kriegs stabbed and slashed at the traitors, pushing the enemy back. Still clutching his las pistol, the captain personally led the assault on the bunker. Even after a direct hit from the Macarius, Fodor could discern figures still holding the defence inside the structure. He gathered the survivors and led them in an assault through the enemy trenches. The captain ordered the guardsmen to throw grenades around every corner, into every cover. Drawing closer, he summoned a squad of flamers, and when they bathed the breach with searing streams of promethium, the guardsmen surged into battle. A second stream ignited all the interior chambers of the bunker, and instantly Fodor, firing from his pistol, jumped into the flame-gripped opening. The rest of the Kriegs followed him and quickly finished off the few surviving heretics in close combat. During the skirmish, a bullet struck his wrist, forcing him to discard his weapon. Bleeding, racked with pain, and covered head to toe in soot, the captain refused to leave the ranks and organized perimeter defense. The first of numerous bunkers of Fort C-585 fell under the onslaught of the Imperium troops, and soon the others followed, each being captured after a furious assault. When reinforcements arrived, the surviving Macarius was established as an additional bastion of the fortress. The 54th Company seized its objective and now appeared to have amassed sufficient strength to hold it. Offensives in other sections of the front line were progressing poorly. For the most part, soldiers were lying in no man's land, taking cover from lethal fire in shell craters. As the news of the 54th Company's success spread, the Imperial forces renewed their attacks. Now that the 54th Company was clearing the enemy's forward trenches, the heretics' artillery fire's intensity weakened. Soon reports came from the 52nd and 31st Companies of successfully completed tasks. The first line of defense of the mortuary ridge had fallen. Riding the lightning. While the 468th Regiment's assault companies were capturing enemy positions, a storm broke out, heralding itself with lightning flashes and thunderclaps. Dark, sulphurous clouds descended upon the battlefield like a monsoon, instantly turning the planet's volcanic dust into grey mud. As the storm expanded, assault drop pods of the Dreadclaw and larger landing shuttles headed towards Vraks from the heart of anarchy stationed in orbit. The Chaos battlecruisers' innards spewed their monstrous cargo, and the gunners aimed their cannons at the planet's surface. In the trenches and dugouts, scattered across the desolate expanse of Van Meersland, the guardsmen felt the overwhelming might of the starship's weapons. The orbital bombardment, heralding the arrival of landing craft, crashed down upon the already ravaged and scorched surface of Vraks. The air hissed and crackled with the strikes of the shipboard lance batteries, their frenzied energy in some places fusing stone into black glass. The macrocannons wrought enormous craters upon the planet's surface, shattering rocks and leaving behind dense clouds of cordite mixed with dust. The siege regiments had no answer to this fiery deluge that descended upon them. No counter-bombardment could quash the fire of such an adversary. Trenches were obliterated with a single hit. Heavy artillery mangled and tossed into the air like children's toys. The Krieg guardsmen swiftly sought refuge from the engulfing storm. Captain Fodor observed the orbital bombardment from within a half-ruined bunker they'd captured, his wounded arm hidden beneath his greatcoat, forming a red stain across his chest. He watched as a yellow fiery streak traced the grey sky, marking the path of a macro-cannon shell as it entered the atmosphere. A distant explosion sent a mushroom cloud skyward before the blast wave reached the captain. Flames poured from the heavens everywhere. Even the trenches along his line at the base of the mortuary ridge suffered a direct hit, the shockwave shaking the bunker like an earthquake. More lightning pierced the sky as drop pods crashed into the atmosphere, trailing fiery tails. The skies darkened with assault shuttles, whose thrusters roared at full capacity, propelling them towards their coveted target. Finally, the ships struck the surface, disgorging from their depths the bloodthirsty, sacrilegious and maddened warbands of the followers of the Dark Gods. The orbital bombardment ceased immediately after the landing began. Most of the forces of Chaos aimed their attacks at the inner lines of the Imperial defense. Bands of Khorne berserkers, such as the Skull-Takers, the World-Eaters and the Berserkers of Scalathrax, began to rage through the trenches, slaughtering all who crossed their path. This was no frontal assault across no man's land, and the Krieg defense was unprepared for such a sudden onslaught. Anti-air defences were practically non-existent, and the primary strength of the regiments was concentrated at the front lines. In an instant, artillery positions and critical supply trenches fell into enemy hands. The chain axes and bolt pistols of Khorne's frenzied warriors turned command bunkers into monstrous, blood-drenched abattoirs. Confusion and chaos reigned everywhere, just as the Lord of Slaughter desired. Isolated engagements in the meticulously organized trench warfare could not correct the predicament of the Krieg guardsmen, suddenly finding themselves encircled by the enemy. Reports of attacks were coming in from distant sectors once believed to be beyond the reach of heretics. At Fort C-585, Captain Fodor and his men found themselves under sudden assault by the crimson-armoured traitors of the Skull-Takers warband. Each renegade was a frenzied, wrathful killer with an insatiable thirst for blood. The Chaos Space Marines burst forth from assault pods and soon cut their way through the trenches, leaving heaps of dismembered guardsmen in their wake. It was a desperate melee, but the Krieg soldiers had virtually no chance of survival. They now faced not mere mortals whose flesh and will could be broken in battle, but Space Marines empowered by the full might of mad gods. They were unstoppable, tearing entire squads of Imperial soldiers to shreds. Captain Fodor attempted to rally his men, but many were already retreating across no man's land. He saw a massive Macarius continuing to fire its heavy bolters, even as the damned legionnaires clambered onto the tank's turret. The traitors tore open the hatches, dragging the screaming crew from the vehicle. One of Khorne's champions grabbed the struggling vehicle commander, lifting him with an outstretched arm. The berserker sized up the wretched mortal with a glance, then decapitated the guardsman with a blood-soaked chain axe. Tossing the headless corpse aside, the champion roared triumphantly and leapt from the turret in search of more victims. Foda's soldiers fired from the remaining embrasures of the half-ruined bunker. Now it was the captain's turn to fend off the advancing enemies. The first Chaos Space Marine to leap into the breach was incinerated by a melter gunshot, turning the legionaries' power armor into a molten lump of metal, but others followed. The guardsmen sheltered from a grenade thrown inside, but were stunned by the powerful explosion. The first grenade was followed by a second, then a third, filling the room with acrid smoke. Chaos soldiers burst through the smoke-filled breach with swords raised above their heads. Fodor drew his sword with his healthy arm and lunged at the nearest foe. His strike was parried, and his weapon shattered by a chain axe. A powerful shoulder blow from the Space Marine sent the captain crashing to the floor, stunning the Krieg soldier. The berserkers stayed close behind their leader, and soon the resistance in the bunker was crushed. Mutilated bodies of the Imperials lay everywhere, their severed heads piled in a bloody heap. The floor became slick with blood streaming from the walls. Stunned and wounded, Fodor crawled across the slippery floor in search of an exit, but was suddenly yanked off the ground with a powerful motion. Barely conscious, he saw the steaming grille of a red helmet, its eyepieces glowing with a deadly light. The helmet was smeared with blood and encrusted with numerous blasphemous runes. Fodor began to choke as the armoured gauntlet of the Chaos Space Marine tightened around his throat. The teeth of the chain axe came to life, and with a swift blow, the berserker added the head of the Krieg captain to the pile of nightmarish trophies. The Skull-Taker's assault drove the 468th Regiment from the mortuary ridge. The sudden planetary drop swept away the Imperials and restored the battle line. Counter-offensive, catastrophe in Sector 61 to 47 inches. The unexpected attack by Chaos forces threw the Death Corps regiments into disarray and changed the nature of the siege of Vraks overnight. The slow, static war of attrition suddenly became more variable, as the heretics now had the ability to strike deep into the Loyalists' rear. A single, continuous front line was no longer the only battlefield. Although the initial strikes caused colossal damage, the reinforcements that arrived in aid of the Cardinal did not yet possess enough heavy weaponry to crush the Guardsmen's fortifications. The forces of Chaos could not hold the territory captured in the raids, and once the initial shock wore off, the Krieg regiments began to recover. In some places the front line was broken, and the enemy consolidated their success and pushed the Imperials back, while in others the Guardsmen stood firm and repelled all attacks. In the following weeks, a substantial quantity of weapons and equipment would be delivered from orbit, and the Chaos troops would attempt to launch more serious assaults. The renegade Cardinal's forces would not fail to exploit the weakness of Imperial forces and would attempt to reclaim lost territories. Where once a clear ring of trenches surrounded the fortress of Vraks, the situation was now less clear. In some places the front line remained intact, while in others Guardsmen were forced to retreat, and traitor forces returned to positions lost over a year ago. The challenge facing the Death Corps was that, having held the initiative for such a long time and deciding where and when to strike the rebels, they now lost this initiative. The war had taken on a defensive nature, and the Loyalists were struggling to hold their positions, repelling fierce offensives by rebels emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements. An even greater problem was supply. After losing control over the Vraks system, the supply lines of the 88th Siege Army were severed. Reinforcements, weapons, ammunition, fuel and provisions were being delivered to the planet from other systems, and although existing stocks would last for a while, there was no way to replenish them. The situation was becoming increasingly dire. How long could the Krieg forces conduct war with ever-dwindling reserves? Based on thousands of reports received from quartermasters, the staff of Lord Commander Zuelka began calculating how much longer the Imperials could hold out. By this time, news of the catastrophe that had befallen Vraks reached the high command of Segmentum Obscurus on Cardia. Concerned that after 10 years of fierce warfare the mission on Vraks was under the threat of complete failure, the command appointed an investigation to ascertain the causes of what went wrong. Led by the Supreme Logister of the Departamento Munitorum, Istar Ornus, the investigation held the right to strip any current command representative of their authority should evidence surface of any officer neglecting their duty to the Emperor. News of the impending rout would be mandatorily relayed to the Lord of the Departamento Munitorum, who would undoubtedly make sure it reached the ears of the High Lords of Terror themselves. Their wrath over the defeat and the wasteful expenditure of valuable resources would lead to the ruin of many careers, with numerous officers falling into the penal legions or being dispatched to confront the growing tyrannid threat on the eastern fringe. However, political machinations aimed at saving face and careers could do nothing to aid the Death Corps faced with the threat of total annihilation on Vraks. But the woes for the Krieg soldiers did not end there. A new threat was looming. To the west of the Chalia Plateau, the downed bane of Aharon spewed forth ever newer blasphemous hosts from its depths. Many perished during the spacecraft's crash landing, but even more survived, and now the heretics were preparing to enter the fray. They were far behind the main defense line of the Imperial Guardsmen, yet the fact offered no relief, for alongside the deranged warriors of chaos marched a multitude of grand war machines, including the Titans of Legio Vulcanum. Like their allies from the Space Marines, the Titan legions were once loyal to the Emperor, but during the Great Heresy, many succumbed to the temptations of the Dark Gods and joined Horus. The survivors of the rebellious Primarch's defeat retreated to the Eye of Terror, where, surrounded by the corruption of the warp and shielded from the ravages of time, the Titans awaited the moment to strike back at the Imperium. In hopes of overthrowing the divine rule of the Emperor, they joined the forces of chaos embarking on black crusades. The hordes emerged from the Bane of Aharon, needing to traverse 160 kilometers across Vrax's surface. Yet they advanced without resistance. The Krieg regiments of the First Line Corps learned of the incoming new army only when it had passed the Mora Gorge and was closing in on the borders of Sector 53. Now, with the rear of one of the corps under threat, the 88th Siege Army had to act hastily to intercept the oncoming enemy. This task fell to the 101st Regiment of the 11th Assault Corps, which was now being massively withdrawn from the front and supplied with armoured support to confront the heretics. The 101st Regiment commenced its advance towards the enemy in the year 823 of the 41st millennium. By the time it reached the positions to begin its attack, the forces of chaos had advanced another 50 kilometers southward, occupying what used to be the rebels' second line of defense. A dangerous strategic situation was unfolding. Loyalists were being pressed on the front, and from the rear, the enemy threatened to cut off the First Line Corps from the rest of the army. Only the 101st Regiment stood in the way of the heretics, preparing to launch an offensive in Sector 47. In case of failure, the Imperials would have to pay dearly for the defeat. The battle began in the year 823 of the 41st millennium. The first to depart were the tank companies of the 101st Regiment, advancing forward in a disciplined line. Lehman Russes and Macariuses, raising columns of dust behind them, drove at a walking pace in parade formation. Following them were the few Titan hunters of the Assault Corps, Shadow Swords and Storm Swords. Next came the infantry, and the column was closed by tractors with field artillery. Heavy artillery was absent because there was no time to ferry the guns with ammunition. There was also not enough time to conduct ground reconnaissance. The approaching horde consisted of mutant slaves, beastmen, traitors, pirates, and other fugitives from imperial justice, who came to Vraks to loot and seek the favour of the gods. The heretics were led into battle by veterans of 1,000 skirmishes, bands of Chaos Space Marines. Towering over them were Titans, shaking the ground with their tread and broadcasting sacrilegious litanies over the battlefield, driving the unholy host into frenzy. The commanders of the First Corps climbed with the commissars onto a small elevation for a better view of the impending battle. They directed their magnoculars at the already mutilated and cratered landscape. As the dust clouds approached, the guardsmen searched for the enemy, knowing that the monstrous silhouettes of the Titans should be the first to appear in the field of vision. In reality, the first strike from the heretics took the Imperials completely by surprise, as it was delivered by the Chaos Flyers bursting into the troubled skies of Vraks. Like a swarm of enraged wasps, the aircraft descended on the defenseless columns of tanks. When bombs were dropped, the beams of laser cannons sliced through the forward armoured squadrons. First one, then a second vehicle disappeared in flashes of flame. Barely had brown geysers of earth and stone started rising to the skies when the disciplined columns scattered in search of cover from the suddenly emerged threat. Until now, aviation had not participated in the siege of Vraks. In an instant, the battle for the planet spread to the aerial domain, now completely dominated by the forces of chaos. Having exhausted their ammunition, the enemy aircraft disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. Despite the losses, the tank companies relentlessly advanced. By this time, the first enemy had appeared on the horizon. Bright flashes from the heavy Titan guns' volleys were distinctly visible. The forward tanks clashed with the advancing heretics, and the infantry disembarked from the chimeras had already taken defensive positions, awaiting the command to open fire. Columns of dust from the approaching armoured wedges of heretics were visible to the left and right. The field artillery was detached from the centaurs and swiftly prepared to fire. Soon the battlefield echoed with the thunderous roar of quad-mounted batteries. Fours of shells surged forward, their small explosions merging into one massive blast, raising clouds of dust that quickly obstructed the view of the Krieger commander. From this point on, reliance had to be placed solely on Vox transmitters. On the front line, it seemed, the enemy had crushed the infantry positions, and the smouldering wrecks of chimeras added to the oppressive landscape. Meanwhile, the Titans had zeroed in and were now exacting a bloody toll from Imperium forces. Brown plumes of dust turned into bluish-black smoke as machines were annihilated by the devastating power of turbolasers, Gatling blasters, and volcano cannons. Though the tanks returned fire, their rounds were easily stopped by the Titans' void shields. Even with super-heavy shadow swords and storm swords, the battle was unequal. One shadow sword moved into a firing position, yet it failed to breach the void shields. A retaliatory salvo from a turbo laser damaged the main weapon, and moments later a series of hits struck the engine compartment and turret, instantly incinerating the command crew. The surviving tankers hastily evacuated the vehicle and fled, as the fully charged capacitors could detonate at any moment. Across the battlefield, hundreds of tank shells exploded, the sky was pierced by laser beams, and soon artillery joined the fray. On the left flank, the heretic armoured divisions joined the battle. Led by the massive, ominous Land Raiders, Predators and Chaos Defilers, the traitors exchanged blows with Leman Russes. The Krieg advance had already stalled after colliding with the overwhelming power of the Titans, and the relentless advance of the Chaos Space Marines littered the battlefield with wrecked vehicles. The battle raged on for over 2 hours, growing ever fiercer. Yet messages coming through the Vox suggested the inevitable. The armoured assault had failed. The enemy once again went on the offensive, spearheaded by Titans marching through explosions and fire. The counterattack by the 101st Regiment was repulsed, and the Guardsmen faced the threat of total annihilation. Orders came to begin a retreat, and a reserve tank company moved forward to cover the organised withdrawal. Out of 16 Leman Russes, not a single one returned. All night, wounded and soot-covered crews of damaged tanks tried to make their way back to their own lines through what had now become enemy territory. Meanwhile, the heretics celebrated their victory, capturing abandoned vehicles which they could turn against the Imperium in the future. Listening to the chorus of voices in the main Vox channels, the commanders of the 101st Regiment counted the plumes of smoke rising above the battlefield. 52, and how many more were hidden by the clouds of dust? For some vehicles had not caught fire. The losses were monstrous, especially in armoured vehicles. Overall, the Imperials lost 70 tanks, including 11 super-heavy ones, as well as 27 artillery pieces and an as-yet uncalculated number of guardsmen. Retreats. The defeat of the 101st Regiment meant that maintaining the blockade ring around the fortress of Vraks was no longer possible. As a result of the heretics' victory, the 1st Line Corps was ordered to abandon its positions and retreat westward. Even then, the Guardsmen had little chance of avoiding the impending confrontation with impending destruction. The eastern flank of the inner line of defence also had to be abandoned to save the surviving forces. The 19th Regiment was ordered to guard the rear guard. This was tantamount to a death sentence, as the Guardsmen would be trapped between the advancing hordes of chaos and the insurmountable Demus Rift. The Krieg soldiers were required to hold out to the last man, forming a nucleus of resistance that would allow the army to regroup and prepare to repel the impending threat. Once encircled, the regiment would no longer be able to receive supplies, and the enemy would inevitably crush it, especially if Titans were deployed. Such sacrifices were necessary to correct the strategic situation, even if only temporarily. In the year 823 of the 41st millennium, the 3rd, 5th and 15th Regiments left their trenches, moving northwest to take up positions currently held by the 30th Line Corps. In turn, the 30th was also ordered to retreat and establish defensive lines on the ruins of Hab Zone 2. The front line lay along the service road leading southeast. To assist them, units of the 11th Assault Corps were deployed to form a strong bastion. Hundreds of thousands of men and machines were set in motion, hastily erecting new fortifications as the mad hordes approached. What was once a war with a clearly defined front line had now turned into utter chaos, with the Guardsmen having to defend multiple directions simultaneously against the heretics' onslaughts. The situation in the eastern sectors became extremely volatile and unpredictable. Even the slim chances of capturing the fortress of Vraks within the campaign's planned timeline were lost forever. Significant efforts would be required just to prevent the siege of Vraks from ending in a disastrous rout, to be continued